Hello and welcome to Tim's BMW repairs and information. Well, this is the first in a new series about BMW systems, and by BMW systems I mean ignition systems, EML, ASC plus T, all the strange ones. And we're starting with the most strangest, if that's the correct way to say it, which is the M70 ignition system. Now, the same ignition system was also used on the E32 straight sixes with the M30 engines, but it reached its zenith with the M70 and it caused the most problems. It really is quite peculiar and it didn't need to be. Why, for instance, if you change your spark plugs on the M70 V12, does the engine not run anymore? And why quite often do you start up the engine on all 12 cylinders and exactly 2 seconds later it'll go on to 6 of them? Yep, it's got this habit of getting all of those sort of problems, scratching your head for a very long time. Well, today I'm going to explain exactly how the V12 ignition system works, and then you can understand why it's so fussy about things like HT leads and spark plugs. They have to be the right ones or it just doesn't work. Right, let's go and have a look at it. Okay, before we go any further, I think we'll have a very quick look at how both the M70 and say an iron V8 ignition system works. Straightforward. Has 12 volt supply via ignition switch through to the primary of the coil, through the contact breaker to chassis. Simple as that. The contact breaker is poked open and closed by the cam on the distributor. Rightio, so it's very simple. Electricity, coil, switch, ground. Produces current in the coil. Now the secondary starts off at chassis ground as well. Goes through the secondary of the coil. Has many more windings, finer windings. Through an HT lead to the distributor. From the distributor down an HT lead to a spark plug. We're going to ignore the distributor for now, because that's superfluous to this argument. Okay, so very simple. As the points open, the magnetic field collapses, produces a voltage in the secondary, goes down an HT lead through a spark plug, big spark, and there you go. The only complication is we've got a capacitor across the points, sometimes called a condenser, and that's there for two things. Stops burning the points to start with, because you'll get a spark drawn off as the points open. And secondly, it gives an exact timing for the length of the spark at the secondary. Without the condenser or capacitor, you get a very sharp spark that sort of comes and goes as you get sparks across it. No good at all. So that's why I've got a capacitor. Okay, so if we just rub that bit out where the contact breaker's in and stuck a transistor there with its capacitor, that's the difference between an iron V8 and an M70 ignition system. Yeah, it's as simple as that. And I know what you're thinking, well, iron V8s, you can have transistor ignition systems. Yeah, no problem at all. Just makes it slightly better, get better HT voltage, better combustion. Jobs are good. And well, the complication is between a V8, iron V8 and the M70 is the iron V8 has a carburettor. Now, what's a carburettor got to do with the ignition system? Well, I'll tell you what it is the carburettor doesn't care where the camshaft is. It's got, from the inlet manifold, goes down to each of the individual cylinders, a valve, the inlet valve opens, slurps some fuel air mixture into it. Now, with an injector system, you've got to know which cycle the camshaft's on. It's no good squirting fuel air into a cylinder where the valve's just about to shut. It's just going to sit there for 2 whole crankshaft revolutions. Yeah, because don't forget we've got 2 crankshaft revolutions per camshaft revolution. So if you've got injectors, you need to know where the camshaft is. And that's why iron V8s with carburettors don't need to know where the camshaft is. So this is the big complication. Okay, so later cars, well, the M60, M62 in the E31, they have a camshaft sensor. So you've got a reluctor plate on the end of one of the camshafts, picked up by a Hall effect device. That goes back to the DME. DME says, that's where the camshaft is. I'm going to squirt fuel into that cylinder next. That's pretty sensible. Now the M70 can't do that. Its DME wasn't advanced enough, but what it can do is have 4 banks of 3 injectors, and it fires 3 of them at the time, and it fires 3 injectors that are coming up to the point where they're either just about to open the inlet valve or coming back through the exhaust stroke ready to open the inlet valve. Okay, so it needs to know where the camshaft is, but it doesn't have a camshaft sensor. Yep, introducing the Doughnut, the silliest idea for many a year. Yep, it's got a Doughnut. Now, we've all heard of the Doughnut if we're talking about M70 engines. It's a coil of wire around one of the HT leads, or in fact over 2 of them on a V12, and it'll be on cylinder 6 and cylinder 12, a little Doughnut thing that goes over the HT lead. And what they're there for is to pick up the signal from that spark plug, or the current that's going from the distributor to the spark plug. Now, we know from our primary school physics that current in the wire produces a magnetic field, and we can use a coil of wire to turn that back into a voltage. It's as simple as that. It's no more complicated than that, honestly. So when cylinder 12 fires, we get a signal from the Doughnut, goes to the DME. DME goes, oh, cylinder 12 just fired. I'll keep my eye on the camshaft and I know exactly which cylinder is going to come up to the inlet stroke. So it now knows where to fire the injectors. Righty-ho, that all sounds perfectly okay, no problem at all. I mean, the little Doughnut's could fizzle out, but I mean, it's not too much of a problem. Well, it is, unfortunately, because on an iron V8, you can have any sort of HT leads you like. You can have copper ones with 0 resistance. It'll just annoy your neighbours as you drive past because it'll interfere with their television picture and their radio signal. But with the M70, we have to have exactly like the right resistance spark plug and exactly the right resistance HT leads. Now, ignoring the HT which goes to the distributor, the leads that run from the distributor to each spark plug has to be 6,000 ohms in resistance. And the spark plug has to be 1,000 ohms in resistance. And you might think, well, a spark plug has infinite resistance, we've just got an air gap at the end of it. Well, it doesn't. When a spark plug fires, it produces a plasma ball which has a very low resistance. So we can effectively say the air gap between the electrodes on a spark plug has 0 resistance, but only when it's firing. The actual resistance from the spark plug comes from the carbon resistor, which is between the top of the spark plug. It's inside the porcelain insulator and it goes down to the centre electrode. And the right resistance spark plugs is 1,000 ohms. So we've got 6,000 ohms for the HT lead, 1,000 ohm for the spark plug. Why is that important? Well, because we've got 20,000 volts divided by 7,000 ohms, and that gives us a current. And it's a current that makes the magnetic field, and it's the magnetic field that makes the voltage in the Doughnut. So if we get the wrong current, then we don't get a signal to a DME. DME says, oh, actually nothing's happening in the ignition system. I'm switching off all the injectors on that bank, and your car stops. After 2 seconds, you get 2 seconds grace. If you don't see a signal from the Doughnut, yeah, injectors cut off and the engine stops. Or in a V12, it'll to keep on running on the other 6 cylinders. Okay, so what's affecting this, the resistance? Well, first of all, even if you buy the right part number spark plug from the right manufacturer, it could be a 10k resistor or a 5k resistor. You've got to make absolutely sure it's the 1k resistor, and that's why you see so many posts on the forum that I've just changed all my spark plugs for exactly the right one, and now the car runs for 2 seconds and stops. Well, it's because you're not getting a signal from the Doughnut because your spark plug has 10k resistance. So have a look at this again. So we've got 6k, 1k. Now if you've got 6k and 10k, the current through there is so much smaller the signal's smaller, DME doesn't see it. It's as simple as that. So you've got to get the right resistance spark plugs. I'll put up the right part number and the resistance in the description, I think, rather than try and remember it all now. And also you've got to have the right resistance HT leads, and that's great because with an iron V8 you can say, I'm going to have a copper leads instead of these stupid 6k resistance ones. So it's working the coil a bit harder than you'd like, and you might fizzle it out, but you still get a good spark. Unfortunately, if you put copper HT leads on an M70 engine, then the current is much higher because you've now just got 1k resistance, 20,000 volts divided by 1000 ohms. Lots of current. The coil doesn't like it and it will melt at some point. But more importantly, the Doughnut signal is saturated. The DME can't understand it, turns the injectors off. So that's why it's so important to get the right HT leads and the right spark plugs. Then you get the right current, right magnetic field, right voltage, right signal to the DME. So that's all that's peculiar about the M70 and the M30, which uses the same system. Ignition system. The problem isn't the ignition system, the problem is the injectors. If you had a carburettor, you would have been fine. It wouldn't matter what you stuck in there. But because it's got injectors, it's got to know the cycle of the camshaft, and it doesn't have a camshaft sensor. So this is the whole point about the M70. Right resistance HT leads and spark plugs. And also, if the spark plug doesn't fire because it's coked up or heavily oil covered, then you don't get a signal from the Doughnut either. So the first thing you do is make sure that spark plug number 12 and number 6 are clean, which just happens to be the ones which are hardest to get to, I'm afraid. It's a shame they didn't put it on number 1 and number 7. It would have been a lot easier, and they could have just written the software slightly differently, but no, there you go. So the signature of no signal from the Doughnut is the engine starts perfectly, sounds perfectly fine, and then after 2 seconds it stops or runs on one bank after 2 seconds, and that's because the injectors are switched off, not because the ignition system isn't working. And of course the test for ignition system is to get a spare spark plug, pop an HT lead off, put a spark plug in it, sit it on something metal on the engine, and then turn the engine, and well, the ignition system's working perfectly because I can see a spark. Well, it might be on that cylinder, but is it working perfectly okay on cylinder 6 and 12? And also, is it the right voltage across the spark plug? Now, an iron V8, just get a simple tester and you see a spark across it, lights up a little neon light, and you think, that's fine, it's working fine. And that's what confounds so many problems with the M70, is the fact that you get a spark, but the ignition system isn't working properly. So you've got the wrong spark plugs or you've got the wrong HT leads. You've got to get those right. And also cylinder 6 and 12 have got fire as well. I mean, the spark has to go across the gaps, because if it doesn't, you don't get any current and you don't get any signal. Okay, well, I think I've waffled on for quite long enough. Put the thumbs up if you enjoyed that. Thanks very much for watching. Keep commenting as well. Put comments on this one and be interested what you think about the M70 ignition system. I'll see you next time.